Following the horrors of World War II, 63 diplomats from different nations came together to sign a series of conventions establishing humanitarian treatment of war prisoners, the sick, non-combatants, and different types of combat. 196 countries signed these agreements, only some with reservations. Though there was humanitarian conventions in prior war times throughout the past, the Geneva Conventions consolidated these past conventions and became the standard for international humanitarian law. In the modern day, the Geneva Conventions serve as the basis for what is allowed in times of war. However, the Geneva Conventions are a failure when it comes to ending warfare as a whole, since they treat war closer to a game with rules, don't push any substantial amount towards world peace, and, in the modern day, it effectively relies on mutual threat to other people instead of a greater authority. Just a quick disclaimer, I do not think we should remove the Geneva Convention. I just think it's bad to say it's the final step of ending war and acting like, oh, we have humanitarian rules, now war is over. I think it's more than that. That being said, welcome to the video. The Geneva Conventions effectively made it so that war had rules instead of being something to be avoided at all costs. In the 23rd episode of Star Trek, the original series, titled A Taste of Armageddon, the crew of the Enterprise encounters two warring planets. In an attempt to mitigate physical damage, the two planets have signed a treaty agreeing to simulate the war and incinerate the victims rather than having any actual bloodshed or hurting the infrastructure of either planet. The episode ends with the captain of the Enterprise destroying the simulation computers. The people of the planet argue that a real war will come soon, but the captain argues that true peace should come soon, instead. The episode ends with peace talks mediated by the Enterprise. Though this episode of Star Trek is not real, it can be easily extrapolated to see there's a world where that logic might make sense for our planet. While we may not be putting people into incinerators, it can be seen that adding rules of war, like in the Geneva Conventions, look like an alternative to a bloody war, and not the end of bloody war. The Geneva Conventions failed to push the United Nations to world peace rather than senseless violence. Consider the effect on someone's lungs of smoking 10 cigarettes a day versus only 1 for a year. Which one is worse? Well, clearly smoking 10 cigarettes a day. However, if we examine the lungs of both people versus someone who didn't smoke for that entire year, it's clear the non-smoker is the healthiest. I'm using this analogy of cigarettes to communicate the idea that war should always be avoided. Cigarettes, like war, are never healthy to smoke and are effectively just poison to the body. The issue of war is not how many people are dying, it is that any people are dying. While the Geneva Conventions do establish an amount of framework for the rules of war, they now are closer to suggestions due to mutually assured destruction. In the modern era of the atomic bomb, the Geneva Conventions rely more on people choosing not to enact mutually assured destruction, rather than real consequences. Mutually assured destruction, or going mad, serves as a much greater deterrent to war rather than another person telling you not to do something. For example, consider cheating a mob boss out of money. The thing keeping you from cheating him isn't that you can't, but rather if you do, he will probably send his men after you and you will die. However, why wouldn't the mob boss just cheat you then? Well, what if you had your own mob protecting you? That is effectively the idea of mutually assured destruction. Neither party is choosing to cheat the other because of a higher authority, but rather because cheating the other party would lead to the mutual end or destruction of both parties. Since we can end ourselves in an hour, the world relies less on a strong authority with the power to say something is wrong and prevent it from happening. Instead, the world is held up on a fragile ecosystem of threats and a fast mutual ending to everything. While I have said all of this against the Geneva Conventions, it's important to note that the Geneva Conventions are a valuable alternative to strict anarchy. With people like Kim Jong-un, it's important to note that without a higher authority, actions like chemical and biological warfare would be more common. So while the Geneva Conventions failed to stop these altogether, they do mitigate some of the horrors of war. However, they are not the final steps toward peace. So, what is the final steps towards peace? To find that out, it's important to look at the primary causes of most wars. In my opinion, they can be lumped into two main categories. The first being belief-based wars. These types of wars include the Crusades of the Dark Ages and many of the wars during the Cold War. The second, and much more common type of war, is a resource war. It took me a very long time to think of a simple and easy solution to belief-based wars. In my first draft of this script, I said everyone should just get along and not kill each other over beliefs, although that really wasn't much of an answer. It was just a shoo-in for it would be better if it didn't happen at all, which obviously it would be. In talking about it with one of my friends, though, we outlined some alternate solutions. I thought of the idea of Brave New World, where the beliefs are instilled in the entire populace from birth, and the rare exceptions to those ways of thinking are forced into exile. However, this idea does remove what makes humanity beautiful and works in a very unethical way to achieve what should be an ethical goal. Next, my friend pitched the idea of the threat of annihilation. In this way, both personal beliefs could be kept and so could a lack of war. However, that goes against the very idea of peace I'm arguing for. I don't just want there to always be a great force saying, don't do this, or else. And thinking about all this, I realized the solution wasn't going to be an easy or straightforward thing a government or group could do. The solution to belief-based wars is on the individuals who held any given belief. It isn't as vague as just not killing people with differing beliefs or not holding those beliefs. The key to ending these types of wars is communication, education, and empathy. However, even beyond that, in education is understanding different biases and getting your information either from an unbiased source or sources on both sides of the equation. It was never about having one government making everything easy. It was about every individual working hard to make the world a better place. However, there is some good news. The ending to the second type of war is a part of our natural evolution as humanity and society. Post-scarcity. Post, of course, meaning after, and scarcity referring to the fact that resources are not infinite. Granted, you may be saying that, truthfully, resources will never be infinite. However, the term more refers to having more than enough to sustain every person on Earth. For example, diamonds used to be valuable when they had scarcity and had to be mined out in parts of the world, then shipped across the globe and refined. However, with the rise of lab-grown diamonds, their price has fallen by magnitudes. Anyways, all of this is to say that without a post-scarcity, everyone is fighting over the same basic resources needed to survive. However, once the issue is boiled down to just beliefs instead of people's basic needs to survive, I believe that we will have our final tastes of Armageddon. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.